Way back on December 26, 1973, cinema audiences witnessed a global phenomenon that redefined the horror genre forever. It was a movie that did far more than just scare the viewers. It inflicted genuine psychological trauma on them. We are, of course, talking about the cinematic masterpiece and cultural juggernaut known as The Exorcist. But long before this narrative became a box office smash, and well before it sparked international controversy or caused people to pass out in pitch-black theatres, it was a secret chronicle recorded in hushed tones by clergymen who honestly hoped these pages would never be made public. The initial manuscripts came with heavy caveats, identities were scrubbed, and specific locations were blurred. Not to amp up the theatrical drama, but to genuinely protect the survivors from the absolute nightmare they had lived through. You see, the entities described in those private notes were not metaphors for evil or symbolic cautionary tales. The witnesses believed they were dealing with something intelligent, incredibly patient, and terrifyingly deliberate. And this entire descent into madness didn't start with a head spin. It started with a simple, innocuous sound, the first sign of the presence lurking behind the disturbances. One of the most chilling details about the true story behind The Exorcist is just how clinically and cautiously it was documented in the beginning. The men writing this down didn't think they were part of a horror movie. They didn't see anything cinematic about it. The earliest written records were strictly confidential, featuring altered names and vague geographical details, with every specific softened, not to make the story better, but to mitigate the collateral damage they feared public scrutiny would unleash on the family. What truly rattled the investigators wasn't the spectacle of the events, but the undeniable pattern behind them. They were convinced that the phenomena unfolding were intelligent, disciplined, and calculated, and it was that specific restraint that made the case impossible for skeptics to just wave away. The backdrop of the story only added to the creeping dread. Go back to 1949 in Cottage City, Maryland, and you will find a place that had zero connection to mass hysteria or religious fanaticism. It was your standard quiet suburb just outside Washington, D.C., a place where families lived out boring, predictable routines and kids were supposed to grow up safe within their ordinary four walls. Douglas and Violet Milson were the picture of that suburban normalcy, as was their teenage son. Ronald, a kid who displayed absolutely no history of psychological issues, no violent tendencies, and certainly no weird religious fixations. Later on, investigators would hammer this point home repeatedly because the total absence of red flags made the sudden shift into darkness incredibly difficult to rationalise or explain away. The nightmare didn't begin with anything violent, dramatic, or overtly supernatural. It began with a noise. Ronald reported hearing a faint rhythmic dripping sound moving through the house while he was trying to study in his room alone. It is a detail that often gets glossed over because it sounds so mundane and harmless. But according to retrospective analysis, what made the sound so terrifying wasn't that it existed, but how it behaved. It didn't stop. It didn't stay in one place. It actually stalked him, getting louder and more distinct as he walked toward his bedroom until it seemed to detach from any physical source entirely. When they threw the door open to check, every surface was bone dry, every faucet was tight, and yet that dripping sound kept going. This specific detail mattered deeply to the investigators later because it marked the first definitive break from logical explanations rooted in plumbing issues, coincidence, or standard household wear and tear. Up until that specific moment, the strange occurrences could still be framed as a homeowner's annoyance rather than a spiritual threat. You could blame an old house settling pipes banging due to pressure changes, or maybe a squirrel moving unseen through the rafters. But when the wall suddenly jolted violently from the inside, the entire nature of the event shifted instantly. That phantom dripping noise cut out just as abruptly as it had started, and in its place came something significantly more disturbing. A slow, deliberate and rhythmic scratching sound coming from right beneath the floorboards. As the investigation went deeper, this moment would be analysed over and over again because it represented the tipping point where rational excuses began to fall apart. It suggested that this wasn't a malfunction, but a pattern. It wasn't an accident, but a display of restraint and intent. For the church authorities involved, this distinction was profound. In the realm of theological evaluation, random chaos can be dismissed. However, deliberate, intelligent behaviour cannot be ignored. The controlled cadence of that scratching became one of the first major red flags that whatever was happening in that house did not behave like an environmental issue. And that realisation quietly shifted the entire trajectory of the case once the logical answers ran dry. The way Douglas Milson reacted is another critical real-world detail that often gets dumbed down in movie retellings. He wasn't a fearful man or easily suggested. He was a total skeptic, methodical in his approach, and absolutely determined to find a boring, mundane explanation for the noise. He reasoned that old houses creak and rats burrow. Urban development pushes animals into homes. To Douglas, the solution was obviously a pest problem, and his actions reflected that stubborn belief. He personally ripped up the floorboards to investigate, hired a professional exterminator, and accepted laying down poison as the reasonable fix. The problem wasn't that his explanation was irrational. The problem was that the evidence refused to back it up. The exterminator came in and found 0 droppings, no tracks, no nesting materials, absolutely nothing consistent with an animal infestation. Even more troubling was the stubborn persistence of the noise. Night after night, the sound continued in the exact same spot, completely unaffected by the poison or the destruction of the floor. When Douglas tore up even more of the flooring and found nothing but empty space, the case entered a terrifying category that skeptics hate to acknowledge, a situation where hard work and logic fail to produce a result. When the scratching finally stopped abruptly, it seemed to validate the animal theory for a moment until 3 days later, when a brand new sound began to echo through the home. Next came a sound that would make your skin crawl, a steady, rhythmic squeaking that listeners compared to the noise of rubber soles shuffling across bare wood. Kicking off at the exact same time every single night and cutting out with clockwork precision. Later on, investigators would point to this specific detail as a smoking gun because random house noises are just that random, whereas consistency suggests something else entirely. Ancient floorboards might groan, but they don't follow a schedule. Now, it's easy to write off Violet Milson's reaction as mere superstition or paranoia. But when you look at what she was actually dealing with, it was really a desperate psychological hunt for any kind of logical answer after every single rational explanation had fallen flat on its face. You see, her sister-in-law Vera, who was heavily into spiritualism, had passed away right before the chaos started, leaving Violet to question if this timing was just a fluke or a message from the other side. Then came the famous incident of the 3 distinct knocks responding to a spoken command, but surprisingly even the family wasn't ready to accept this as undeniable proof just yet. In fact, Douglas refused to buy into it at all, shutting down the idea immediately. What finally tipped the scales wasn't a sudden leap of faith, but the sheer weight of mounting evidence as physical objects started moving on their own. We're talking about furniture sliding across the room, and a massive heavy table allegedly flipping over and slamming onto the floorboards. And here is the kicker: Ronald was close by every single time it happened, raising the uncomfortable suspicion that the house wasn't the problem, he was. Douglas went from being a skeptic to being suspicious, not because he wanted to blame his own kid, but because they had literally run out of other options. They decided to bring in the doctors as a last-ditch effort to find a rational cause, but the medical evaluations came up completely empty. The specialists concluded that Ronald was physically fit and psychologically sound, noting only that the poor kid was suffering from severe stress due to sheer terror. This was a massive deal because it effectively stripped away the last safety net of logic and science that the family had been clinging to. With medical pathology ruled out and environmental causes making 0 sense, Violet turned to the church, not necessarily because she believed in demons, but because she was utterly exhausted. The plan proposed by their Lutheran minister to take Ronald out of the home is actually one of the most telling aspects of this entire saga. Primarily because it wasn't a religious ritual at all. It was a calculated scientific experiment. The logic was simple: if the chaos stopped, the house was haunted. But if the chaos followed the boy, they were dealing with something infinitely more terrifying. And when those chilling, scratching sounds started up again at the precise same hour inside the minister's own residence, the experiment gave them a definitive answer. This wasn't about a haunted location anymore. The phenomenon was undeniably attached to the child himself. That realization is the real starting point of the case that inspired The Exorcist not as some campfire ghost story, but as a documented collapse of every rational explanation. It forced everyone involved, from doctors to clergy, to face something they couldn't label, couldn't dismiss, and certainly couldn't control. It was this specific detail that finally compelled the church to step in and take the situation seriously. You know, one of the creepiest parts of the true story behind The Exorcist isn't even a specific monster moment or jump scare. It is actually that specific moment in time when being a skeptic was no longer an option. Up until then, you could still argue away the events with logic. You could claim the weird noises were just stress manifesting, or maybe just coincidence, or even the wild imagination of a scared teenager. You could argue that the moving objects were just exaggerated stories, so even the family's hysteria could be written off as a feedback loop where their fear just created more fear. As long as the events were isolated, you could poke holes in them, but everything changed the second the phenomenon crossed the threshold and followed Ronald out of his house. According to the official records kept by the clergy later on when Ronald stayed overnight at the Lutheran minister's place, those exact same scratching noises started up again. Same time, same rhythm, same relentless persistence. This detail was more critical than any other spooky occurrence because it completely wiped out an entire category of logical explanations. See if the disturbances were just linked to the property itself. Then you could still blame it on the environment, bad plumbing rats in the walls, settling foundations, or even subconscious triggers. But the moment that activity showed up in a completely different building, all those comfortable theories fell apart instantly. It became crystal clear that the phenomenon wasn't haunting a place, it was stalking the boy. This shift was the absolute turning point in how everyone understood what was happening. It took the situation from being a weird house story and turned it into something much more focused, personal, and deeply troubling. Theologians would later say this distinction is everything a haunting is about a location, but an attachment that implies conscious intent. That is exactly why this detail became the foundation for the Exorcist movie, where the evil isn't stuck in the walls or the attic, but is coming directly for one specific person. The real-life case didn't arrive at this conclusion through blind faith, but through a cold process of elimination, by systematically striking down every other possible reason until only the impossible was left. And what happened after that realization is easily one of the most disturbing parts of this true story, something that Hollywood movies usually gloss over or simplify. This is the exact second where the entire nightmare shifted from psychological fear to physical danger. You see noises in the walls and bad vibes are subjective. You can debate those all night. But physical injuries, those are undeniable. Witnesses were absolutely floored when they saw deep scratches carving themselves into Ronald's body, appearing out of nowhere, while his hands were clearly visible and away from his skin. We are not talking about mysterious bruises found the next morning or marks noticed after the fact. People literally watched in real time as the skin split and angry red lines rose up as if an invisible claw was drawing on him. That specific detail terrified everyone because it completely forced the medical experts to change their game plan. The doctors ran every test imaginable and found zero evidence of self-harm, no mental illness that would explain faking it, and no skin condition that could write messages on a chest. Now, modern skeptics love to claim it was all psychosomatic or just some extreme reaction to stress. And to be fair, the human mind can do wild things to the body, so that argument usually holds some water. However, those theories fall apart when you look at the precise timing, the placement, and the deliberate repetition of these injuries. Stress hives might happen, but they do not form distinct, intelligent patterns under your shirt while a room full of people is watching you like a hawk. The fact that they could not explain these wounds didn't make the doctors believers in the supernatural overnight, but it absolutely convinced them that they were dealing with something that was way outside the pages of a medical textbook. This escalation backed the Lutheran minister into a corner, forcing him to admit that his own religious playbook was useless here. You have to understand, Lutherans do not do exorcisms. They don't have a protocol for it, and they actively avoid picking fights with dark spirits. Their view is that challenging a demon just makes it stronger, so they prefer calm prayers and therapy to handle issues. But even with that mindset, the minister took one look at this chaos and realised it had gone way beyond anything his tradition could fix. That choice to refer the boy out is one of the most telling parts of this scandal, because it wasn't a snap decision. They didn't just hand the boy over to the Catholics immediately like it was standard procedure. That only happened after a rational Protestant minister, someone trained to hate superstition, ran out of every single logical explanation he had. His referral wasn't him saying, "I believe in possession." It was him saying, "I have reached my limit." He didn't claim to know what the hell was going on, only that he was completely powerless to stop it. That admission screams volumes about how bad things were. It proves the case had crossed a terrifying line. It reached a point where you couldn't just be a skeptic anymore, not because you believed, but because being unsure was the only honest option left. The situation was too messy to dismiss, and it refused to fit into any neat little box of science or religion. Medicine had hit a wall, psychology was stumped. Protestant theology had no manual for it. What happened next wasn't about faith, it was about desperation and pure exhaustion. This is the moment the Catholic Church had to step in. Not because they wanted the glory, but because everyone else had slowly backed out of the room. Calling in the priest wasn't a spiritual act, it was a necessary survival tactic. And honestly, the fact that this decision came from total failure rather than religious belief is what makes it so disturbing. It shows that they didn't jump to conclusions. They just systematically eliminated every other option until an exorcism was the only card left to play. That moment when skepticism didn't break, but just ran out of road. That is the true origin story of the case that would eventually give us the movie, The Exorcist. Now let's talk about the botched exorcism that inspired the film's most horrifying scenes. Here is a dark detail most people miss the first time the Catholics tried to intervene. It ended in total failure and physical injury. They brought in Father Albert Hughes, a young priest, with zero experience fighting demons, and even then, the church was super hesitant to call it possession. He was sent there just to observe the situation, not to start a spiritual war. That caution is actually how the real church operates, lots of red tape, unlike the movies where they rush in with holy water blazing. But according to the priest's own story, everything flipped when Ronald's behaviour suddenly changed. The kid started shouting in perfect Latin, a language he never learned, dropping lines that claimed he was pure evil. Skeptics say he could have memorised it, but the intensity and the timing terrified everyone in that room, especially with the fresh wounds appearing. That terror led to one of the biggest decisions in the entire saga. Ronald was secretly checked into Georgetown Hospital, a Catholic facility, so they could attempt an exorcism under strict medical supervision. This detail is crucial because it busts the biggest Hollywood myth of them all. It proves that real exorcisms often happen in sterile hospital rooms, not on dramatic candlelit church floors. When you dig into the archives, you realise these rituals are usually performed in hospitals for one specific reason: safety. In this case, that safety net failed and the danger became terrifyingly real. People inside the room described absolute chaos. We are talking about the bed literally sliding across the floor and violent tremors while angry red scratches clawed their way across Ronald's skin even though he was tied down. But the detail that really messes with your head isn't just the physical violence. It is the shocking way the encounter came to a bloody halt. According to the reports, Ronald managed to rip one hand free from the restraints. With strength that shouldn't be humanly possible, he tore a jagged metal spring straight out of the mattress. Then he plunged that makeshift weapon into Father Hughes's arm. This wasn't a small cut, it was a savage wound that required nearly 100 stitches and left the priest with permanent nerve damage. If that sounds familiar, it is because Hollywood lifted this scene straight from the secret files for The Exorcist. The movie shows exorcism exactly as it was that day, not some glorious spiritual victory, but a gritty, dangerous brawl that leaves real scars. Back in the real world, the church pulled the plug immediately. They realised Father Hughes was in no condition to keep fighting this battle. Stopping right there might have actually saved the priest's life, But for Ronald, things didn't get better. They spiralled further into darkness. Strange new markings started carving themselves into his flesh, spelling out words. This is another creepy detail that the filmmakers decided to put on the big screen later on. When the name Louis appeared on the boy's body, the terrified family didn't think it was a coincidence. They took it as a command. It was a choice driven by pure panic, not logic. You have to understand, by this stage, the doctors, the psychiatrist and the priest had all hit a brick wall. Nothing was working. What makes this part so chilling isn't whether they read the message right. It is the fact that this family was so broken by fear that they were willing to follow instructions carved into their son's skin. So they packed up and ran to St. Louis, hoping that a change of scenery might break the curse. They had no idea they were walking right into a trap. This move put them on a collision course with the priest who would handle the final, most volatile exorcism a chapter the church likes to keep quiet. One of the most scandalous and hush-hush aspects of the true story behind The Exorcist isn't the levitation or the shouting. It isn't the horrific injuries or even the creepy testimonies from the people who were in the room. The real shocker is the hesitation. It is the cold feet that happened after that first disastrous attempt to save the boy. After the bloodbath at Georgetown Hospital, the church didn't double down immediately. Contrary to the urban legends, things didn't escalate right away. Everything just stopped. The momentum died. For a while, there was total radio silence on the case. That pause is crucial because it exposes something way scarier than the supernatural spectacle we see in movies. It showed that the church was rattled. The attack on Father Hughes proved that their holy rituals weren't a guaranteed fix. They had lost control. That injury was a wake-up call. It proved that whatever was inside that boy couldn't be tamed, predicted or handled by the standard rulebook. For an organisation that relies on strict order and ancient rules, this chaos was completely terrifying. Exorcism is supposed to be this powerful, decisive act. Instead, it looked reckless, dangerous, and worst of all, totally useless. So the church didn't charge back in like heroes. They retreated. They got extremely cautious. By the time the family fled to St. Louis, the vibe of the case had shifted. It wasn't about rushing in anymore. It was about slow, careful deliberation. This is where Jesuit Father William Bowden enters the picture. And let me tell you, the fact that they picked him tells you everything you need to know. They didn't pick him because he was famous or known for big dramatic showdowns with demons. No, they picked him for his personality. He was the right man for a job that had gone sideways. Bowden was a Jesuit. That order isn't known for getting emotional or fiery. They are the intellectuals known for discipline and strict psychological analysis. Plus, he was a World War II chaplain. He had spent years in the trenches with soldiers, seeing death, mental breakdowns, and the absolute worst of humanity. That background is key, even if movies usually skip over it. Bowden wasn't the type of guy to get spooked easily. He had witnessed real fear and violence in war zones where staying calm was the only way to stay alive. That gritty experience defined how he handled this possession. He didn't walk in expecting a magic show or a quick fix. He walked in expecting a mess. And right off the bat, he started asking the tough questions that nobody else was asking. One detail really bugged him. Why did the family feel forced to move to St. Louis in the first place? If this was just a haunted house situation, moving makes sense. But if the demon is attached to the kid running away, doesn't actually solve anything. And if the instruction to move came from the entity itself, then running to St. Louis wasn't an escape. It was a setup. This thought process changed the entire game. It meant this wasn't just random, chaotic evil. It was a strategic move by an intelligent enemy. That suspicion took the case out of the standard good versus evil script. It wasn't just a power struggle. It was a chess match. It pointed to something way more twisted: psychological manipulation, misdirection, and controlling the players through fear and confusion. For a priest trained to spot the lies of the devil, this possibility was a massive red flag. It suggested that the entire situation might be... The entity wasn't backing down. In fact, it was getting stronger. and adapting to every single move the priest made, which meant Father Bowden knew he couldn't just charge in like a cowboy. He absolutely refused to fly solo on this nightmare, and he realised pretty quickly that this wasn't going to be a one-and-done kind of deal. Instead, he braced himself for a slow, agonising grind, keeping everything strictly under wraps. This wasn't going to be some Hollywood showdown. It was a gruelling marathon that stretched out over weeks of pure tension. They ran the sessions over and over again, watching every single twitch and documenting the horror with obsessive detail that feels almost chilling to read today. Access was totally restricted. Only a tiny circle of insiders were allowed in the room because keeping this quiet was the #1 priority. They weren't hiding it to be mysterious. They were hiding it because they were terrified and didn't know what they were dealing with. It wasn't a march to victory. It was just a desperate attempt to survive the night. You couldn't even tell if they were winning because there were no high fives or aha moments where they felt safe to say it was working. Every single time they walked out of that room, they weren't clearer on the truth. They were just completely wiped out and drained of energy. Just when things seemed to chill out, the chaos would explode all over again. The physical toll was massive, wrecking not just the poor kid, but breaking down the priest too. It wasn't about shouting commands or showing power. It was a test of pure grit, patience, and the ability to take a beating without quitting. And folks, this is exactly where the true story goes totally off script compared to the blockbuster movie version we all know. In the movies, the tension builds up to this massive explosive finale, but in real life, it just led to bone-deep exhaustion for everyone involved. The creepiest part was that nobody knew if they were actually fixing anything or just trapped in a never-ending loop of hell they couldn't understand. The church buried this part of the file deep, probably because admitting they had zero control over the situation looks really bad for business. This wasn't a hero story where the holy power crushes the chaotic evil effortlessly, like in the scripts. It was actually a terrifying look at authority figures flying blind, barely holding it together with tools that weren't working. Big institutions hate admitting weakness, which is exactly why this specific case sends shivers down your spine even in 2026. It's not just that something paranormal happened. It's that the experts in charge frankly admitted they couldn't control it. If you look at the private diaries, you don't see swagger or confidence. You see people walking on eggshells. It wasn't about winning, it was about not giving up, and the silence surrounding the aftermath screams louder than any explanation ever could. When you really dig into the true story behind The Exorcist, the freakiest part isn't even the flying furniture or the voices. It's the massive, desperate cover-up attempt to bury the truth and how spectacularly that plan fell apart over the years. From day one, everyone involved was super secretive, changing names, hiding locations, and scrubbing the details to protect the innocent. The files were basically classified, passed around only to the absolute essential personnel who could keep their mouth shut. They weren't just scared of a tabloid scandal. They genuinely believed that dragging this into the spotlight would destroy the family even more than they already were. It was all about protection, not fame, with a very simple endgame in mind for the team. Lock the story down, let the family heal in peace, and stop this nightmare from turning into a global media circus. But here's the kicker: you can't bury a cold case that never actually froze. Despite all the hush money vibes, the story leaked out through whispers and secret diaries. Ironically, the harder they tried to silence it, the stronger the legend became in the underground circles. That's the thing about unsolved mysteries. They don't just fade away, they haunt you forever. The reason this story won't die is that nobody can figure out where to file it. It just doesn't fit into any normal box. It wasn't a hoax because nobody was making money or getting famous off it at the time it happened. It wasn't just mental illness because every shrink who looked at the kid couldn't find a diagnosis that explained the crazy stuff happening. And get this, even the church wouldn't officially stamp it as supernatural because nobody wanted to go on record saying they knew for sure. Every theory explains a tiny piece of the puzzle, but leaves the rest of the picture completely in the dark. That giant gap in the facts created a perfect storm for rumours and wild theories to take over the narrative. Let's be real, we hate not knowing the answer, especially when it involves creepy stuff, religious figures, and unexplainable violence. When something is this unexplainable, people can't stop talking about it, twisting it and retelling it to their friends. We retell it to try and make sense of the madness. The story survived not just because it's scary, but because the church essentially left the file open. They handled that grey area like it was radioactive material that could burn them. The few documents they actually had weren't exactly put on a billboard or debated on the evening news. They locked them away in a vault, rarely looked at them, and when they did, it was with pure dread. The famous diary that inspired the movie wasn't written to prove demons exist. It was written by a guy who was confused and terrified. And that confusion is a nightmare for them. Big organisations can handle bad news as long as it's a closed chapter. What they can't handle is a mystery that never ends, because unsolvable doubt strips away their authority faster than any scandal ever could. It exposes the absolute breaking point. It highlights the exact moment where all our carefully built systems meant to diagnose, explain and maintain control simply hit a wall and collapse. For an organisation that survives on rigid rules and clear interpretations, holding onto a file with no clear ending was a massive gamble. However, destroying the evidence would have been an even bigger mistake, so they chose the middle ground. They neither confirmed it to the press nor denied it happened. They just buried it in the archives. But you cannot silence a story just because the powers that be want it to go away. Legends have a way of leaking out. When the details finally bled into the mainstream through books and the silver screen, the story didn't explode because it solved the mystery, but because it kept the same terrifying tension as the real-life events. The Exorcist became a cultural phenomenon specifically because it denied the audience the closure they desperately wanted. It refused to offer certainty. Instead, it served up raw struggle, crippling doubt, and absolute exhaustion, exactly how the original case actually concluded. There was no press conference explaining the outcome. No handshake agreement on the facts, and no definitive victory announced, just a heavy, suffocating silence. And that silence, calculated, institutional, and completely unresolved, became the most haunting character in the entire saga. Questions without answers echo far longer than neat conclusions ever could. And this case produced nothing but echoes. That is precisely why even now in 2026, this story refuses to die. The reason the secret diary was never meant to see the light of day. When you dig into the scandal behind The Exorcist, the most disturbing detail isn't what the Catholic Church shouted from the rooftops, but what they quietly locked away and hoped you would forget. The priest's diary, that infamous document which eventually sparked the novel and the blockbuster movie, was never intended as a public statement. It wasn't written to convert the faithful or to pick a fight with skeptics. It was a private internal logbook compiled with methodical, almost surgical precision by a man who cared more about cold, hard facts than spiritual interpretations. The vibe of the diary is shockingly dry and restrained. You won't find flowery religious language designed to scare you into church or pump up your faith. Instead, it reads like a police report, dates, times, strange behaviours, physical marks and results, all recorded with a deliberate emotional detachment. There are no cinematic moments, no proclamations of holy victory, and absolutely no bragging about divine miracles. Honestly, the total lack of theological confidence is what makes reading it so incredibly uncomfortable. It reads less like a testament of faith and more like a field report from a soldier who didn't fully understand the enemy he was fighting, but knew he had to write it down anyway. That lack of drama is exactly the point. Look, if the church viewed this case as a slam dunk proof of possession and a clear win for their team, they would have waved this diary around as undeniable proof of their power. Historically speaking, big institutions never hesitate to splash a story across the headlines if it makes them look legitimate and powerful. Yet this specific diary was shoved into the back of a dark cabinet, referenced only in whispers and kept hidden from the public eye for decades. The way they handled it screams of anxiety rather than confidence, revealing deep hesitation rather than spiritual certainty. But what makes the diary truly nightmare-inducing is what is missing from its pages. It offers zero final explanations. It makes no attempt to fix the glaring contradictions between the doctors, the psychiatrists, and the priests. It never claims to know what actually caused the chaos in that bedroom. Instead, it documents something far less satisfying and infinitely more disturbing: The craziness just stopped. The supernatural activity faded out. The case was closed because the event ended, not because they solved the puzzle. That distinction is everything. Just because the bleeding stops doesn't mean you understand the wound. The diary captures an ending without a cause, and that kind of ambiguity destroys every logical framework we rely on to feel safe. From a PR and management perspective, a file this unresolved is practically radioactive. It doesn't prove the religious doctrine, but it doesn't support the skeptics either. It sits in that awkward grey zone where authorities have to admit they aren't in control. This is almost certainly why the diary was suppressed. It doesn't strengthen anyone's belief system. It complicates everything. It doesn't make you feel safe. It makes you question reality. For the Vatican, holding on to the document without promoting it was their way of admitting, yes, this happened, without having to say, and we know what it was. In this specific scandal, keeping their mouth shut was safer than guessing. That lingering question mark is exactly what gives The Exorcist its staying power. Unlike your typical slasher flick, the evil here isn't theatrical or over the top. It is invasive routine and absolutely exhausting. The narrative doesn't focus on big special effects, but on the slow erosion of health, the breaking of trust, and the collapse of authority figures. The doctors run out of ideas, the parents lose hope, even the priests start to doubt their own religion. The film mirrors the most crucial aspect of that secret diary. It isn't about fear, it is about the terror of uncertainty. Audiences pick up on this difference instinctively, even if they have never seen the real case files. There is a heaviness beneath the movie that feels earned, a lingering sense that the story is rooted in something that was never truly solved and that it was left unresolved on purpose. The crushing weight of this entire scandal comes straight from the fact that the secret diary simply refuses to spill the tea and give us the answers we are dying for. At the end of the day, the true nightmare fueling The Exorcist stays disturbing. Not because it hands us absolute proof of the supernatural on a silver platter, but because it dramatically exposes just how fragile and useless our logical safety nets become when the pressure really starts to pile on. We are talking about top-tier medicine psychology, religious doctrine, and skepticism. They were all thrown at this chaotic mess. And every single one of them hit a brick wall, failing to cross a line into understanding what was actually happening. So whether you want to believe the kid was legitimately possessed, suffering a total mental breakdown, or just trapped in a twisted, perfect storm of stress and hysteria, this case forces us to admit a pretty ugly truth. For a long stretch of time, absolutely nobody involved had a single clue what they were dealing with. That terrifying uncertainty, which was secretly recorded, locked away in archives and never actually cleared up, is not a plot hole in the narrative. It is the exact reason this dark legend is still living rent-free in our heads all these years later. If this deep dive made you second-guess reality, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more exposed secrets behind the world's most controversial films. And do not be shy, sound off in the comments section right now and tell me what you think really went down in that room.